Blood and rain soaked the ground together, and Lila Hart froze at the edge of the tree line, her heart slamming against her ribs. Something was crying in the dark, a thin, broken sound that did not belong to the wind or the storm. She had only come out here to escape the noise of the pack house, to breathe air that did not smell of smoke and judgment, but now every instinct in her body told her to run toward the sound instead of away from it. She pushed through wet branches, her boots sinking into mud, until she found them. 3 small wolf pups, huddled together under the broken roots of a fallen tree, shivering so hard their tiny bodies shook the leaves around them. Beside them lay 2 adult wolves, still and silent, their fur matted dark and wrong in a way that made Lila's stomach turn. She did not need to check to know they would never rise again. She pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound. Whoever, or whatever, had done this could still be close. The forest around her felt suddenly enormous and hostile, every shadow suspicious, every gust of wind a possible threat. But the pups kept crying, and one of them, the smallest, turned its face toward her and let out a sound so helpless that it broke through every ounce of fear she had. Lila was an Omega. In her pack, that word meant more than a rank. It meant invisible. It meant last in line for food, last to be spoken to, first to be blamed. She had spent years learning how to disappear in plain sight, how to keep her head down and her opinions quieter than her footsteps. An Omega who caused trouble did not get warnings. An Omega who caused trouble simply vanished from pack gatherings, and nobody asked where they had gone. Taking in orphaned pups without permission from the Alpha was not a small rule. It was law. Every pup born or found within pack territory belonged, in some official sense, to the pack itself, and decisions about their fate rested with leadership alone. An Omega making that choice on her own was not just breaking tradition. It was defiance, the kind that could see her exiled or worse. She knelt anyway. The pups did not know anything about rank or law. They only knew cold and hunger and the absence of the mother who should have been curled around them. When Lila reached out a trembling hand, the smallest one pressed its wet nose into her palm and did not pull away. Something inside her chest cracked open, an old ache she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten it was there. She knew what it meant to be small and unwanted, in a world that had already decided you did not matter. She was not going to let 3 innocent pups learn that lesson tonight, not while she still had breath in her body. She looked around one more time, searching the darkness for any sign of movement, any hint of the danger that had taken these pups' parents. There was nothing but rain and shadow and the distant howl of a wolf calling out somewhere far across the valley, a sound that could have belonged to a hunting party or simply to grief. She could not risk staying to find out which. Lila gathered all 3 pups into her arms at once, surprised by how light they were, how fragile beneath their damp fur. They pressed against her, seeking warmth, and she felt their tiny hearts beating fast against her skin. She pulled her jacket around them as best she could and began walking, careful to avoid the main paths that led back toward the pack house. She knew a place, an old den dug into the hillside near the river, abandoned since before she had joined the pack. Nobody went there anymore. It would have to be enough. The walk felt endless. Every snapping twig made her flinch. Every distant sound made her grip the pups tighter and quicken her pace. She kept replaying the image of the fallen wolves in her mind, wondering who they had been, wondering what kind of creature could leave 3 pups alone and defenseless in a storm. She forced the thought away. There would be time to wonder later. Right now, survival came first, for the pups and for herself. By the time she reached the den, her arms ached and her clothes were soaked through, but the pups had finally stopped shivering quite so violently, warmed by the heat of her body and the shelter of her jacket. She set them down gently on a bed of dry leaves she gathered in armfuls, working quickly, driven by an urgency she did not fully understand. These pups were strangers to her. She owed them nothing by any law of the pack, and yet she found herself unwilling to imagine leaving them, unwilling to imagine walking away and letting the forest decide their fate. She sat back on her heels and studied them properly for the first time. 2 had fur the color of dark honey, and 1 was nearly black, with a small white patch above its left eye. That one, the smallest, was the one who had reached for her first. It climbed unsteadily toward her lap, and curled up there, as though it had always belonged, and something about the trust in that small gesture nearly undid her. Lila Hart had been alone for a long time. She had a place in the pack, technically. A bed in the lowest wing of the pack house, a name on the roster, a rank that guaranteed her scraps and silence. But she had not felt like she belonged anywhere in years. Watching these pups settle against her, trusting her completely, despite having no reason to, she felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. She felt needed. She knew she could not keep them here forever without someone noticing. Pack scouts patrolled these borders regularly, and sooner or later her scent, mixed now with 3 unfamiliar pups, would draw attention. She would need food, blankets, and a plan, none of which she had the luxury of gathering while sitting in a hillside den in the middle of the night. But for now, in this moment, none of that mattered. For now, 3 lives that would have ended in the cold rain were breathing steadily against her, warm and safe. The largest of the honey-colored pups let out a small yawn and pressed closer to its siblings. The black pup with the white patch kept its eyes on Lila's face, as if memorizing her, as if deciding that she, of everyone in the world, was the one it would trust. Lila reached out and stroked its head with one careful finger, and the pup leaned into her touch without hesitation. "I don't know what's out there," she whispered, so quietly the words barely disturbed the still air of the den. "But I promise you, I'm not going to let it find you again." She meant every word, even though she had no idea, in that moment, just how impossible a promise it would turn out to be, to keep quietly. She had no idea that hiding 3 growing pups from an entire pack would test every skill of patience and secrecy she possessed. She had no idea that somewhere above her, in the towering pack house that ruled this territory, a man with far more power than she could imagine was about to notice something was different, something was changing, though he did not yet know what. Alpha Gideon Cross had ruled the Ashwood pack since the sudden death of his father, and in the years since, he had built a reputation as fair but unyielding. He listened to his advisors. He respected tradition. He did not tolerate secrets, especially secrets that touched on pack law, and especially secrets involving the safety of the pack's future, which pups always represented. If he had known, in that storm-soaked night, that 3 orphaned lives were being sheltered against every rule he upheld, he would have demanded answers immediately. But he did not know. Not yet. For now, the only creature aware of what had happened in the forest was a quiet, overlooked Omega who had just made a decision that would change everything, though she could not have guessed how far the ripples of that choice would travel. Morning came slowly, gray light filtering weakly through the clouds that still hung low over the valley. Lila woke stiff and cold, her body curled protectively around 3 small, warm shapes that had not moved from her side all night. For a moment, in the haze between sleep and waking, she forgot where she was, and simply enjoyed the strange, unfamiliar comfort of not being alone. Then memory returned, sharp and immediate, and with it came the weight of everything she now had to figure out. She needed food. Pups this young required more than she could easily provide without raising suspicion, and she had no idea, precisely, how young they were, or what that meant for their needs. She needed to keep them hidden, which meant returning to her duties in the pack house without drawing attention to her absence the night before, and finding excuses to slip away regularly, without anyone growing curious. She needed, more than anything, to keep her nerve, because if she faltered now, if she let fear win, 3 lives that had already lost so much would lose everything. The black pup stirred first, lifting its head and blinking sleepy eyes at her. It let out a small, questioning sound, somewhere between a whimper and a chirp, and nudged its nose against her hand. Lila smiled, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her body. "Good morning to you too," she murmured. "Let's figure out how we're going to do this." She spent the next hour studying the den, memorizing its layout, testing which corners stayed driest, which gave the best cover from the entrance in case anyone happened to wander close. She gathered more leaves and soft moss, building a nest that would hold warmth even after she left. She examined the pups as closely as she dared, noting their size, their coloring, the way they moved, searching for any clue about who their parents might have been and why they had been out in that particular stretch of forest, far from any den she knew of within pack territory. The 2 honey-colored pups seemed to be siblings, nearly identical apart from small differences in the shading around their ears. The black pup, with the white patch, looked different enough that Lila wondered, briefly, if it came from a different litter entirely, perhaps adopted by the fallen mother, the way Lila herself was now adopting all 3. It did not matter, not really. What mattered was that they were alive, and they were hers to protect now, whether the pack's laws agreed or not. By the time the sun climbed higher and the worst of the storm clouds began to thin, Lila knew she could not delay any longer. She needed to return to the pack house before her absence became a topic of conversation. She gathered the pups close, pressed a gentle hand over each small head in turn, and made herself a silent promise that she repeated inside her mind like a prayer. She would come back. She would bring food. She would find a way to make this work, no matter what it cost her. Walking away from that den was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Every step felt like a betrayal, even though she knew, logically, that leaving was the only way to keep them safe in the long run. She could not shelter 3 pups from a hillside den forever, without support, without supplies, without some version of a plan that stretched further than one desperate night. But as their small cries faded behind her, replaced by the ordinary sounds of the waking forest, she felt the ache of separation settle deep into her chest, a feeling she recognized instantly, because it mirrored every lonely night she had spent since arriving in this pack, with no one to claim her as family. She did not know, as she made her way back toward the pack house with mud on her boots and secrets in her heart, that her life was about to become far more complicated than she could have imagined. She did not know that keeping 3 pups hidden was nearly impossible in a pack full of sharp noses and sharper eyes. She did not know that somewhere in the days ahead, the Alpha King himself would begin to notice things were not quite as they should be. All she knew, as the pack house came into view through the thinning trees, was that she had made her choice, and there was no turning back from it now. The days that followed tested every ounce of patience Lila possessed. She learned to slip away from her duties in small increments, claiming errands that took her toward the forest edge, gathering extra food from the kitchens under the guise of her own hunger, and hiding portions of meat and bread inside cloth, wrapped tightly enough to mask the scent. She learned the patrol schedules of the pack scouts by careful observation, timing her visits to the den around their rounds. She learned to move quietly, to breathe evenly, even when her heart pounded from fear of discovery, to smile blandly at anyone who might question where she had been. The pups grew stronger with each passing day, their eyes brightening, their small bodies filling out with the food she brought. They began to explore the den more confidently, tumbling over each other in small, clumsy play fights that made Lila laugh out loud despite herself, a sound she had almost forgotten she was capable of making. The black pup, whom she had quietly begun calling Fen in the privacy of her own thoughts, remained the boldest of the 3, always the first to greet her, always the last to settle down for the night. She should have known, she would tell herself later, that hiding 3 growing pups could not last forever. She should have known that pups this lively, this curious, would eventually find a way to test the boundaries she tried so carefully to set. But in those early days, caught up in the fierce, protective love that had grown so quickly in her heart, she allowed herself to believe, just for a little while, that she might actually succeed at keeping her secret safe. She was wrong, though the truth of just how wrong would not become clear until the pups did something neither of them expected. They began to follow her. It started small, a quiet trail of paw prints leading away from the den one morning, when Lila arrived to find only 2 pups waiting instead of 3. Panic seized her instantly, sharp and cold, until she followed the tracks a short distance through the underbrush and found Fen sitting patiently at the edge of the tree line, staring in the direction of the pack house, as though waiting for permission to follow further. She scooped him up with trembling hands and scolded him gently, though the words came out softer than she intended, undercut by relief. She should have taken it as a warning. Instead, she told herself it was a fluke, an accident born of curiosity, rather than any deliberate attempt to follow her. She carried Fen back to the den, settled him beside his siblings, and reinforced the barrier of branches she had built at the entrance, certain that would be enough to keep them contained during the hours she could not be there to watch them. It was not enough. Within days, all 3 pups had learned to squeeze through gaps in her makeshift barrier, and Lila found herself facing a new and far more dangerous problem. The pups no longer wanted to stay behind when she left. They wanted to come with her, and pups that young did not understand the concept of danger, of secrecy, of pack law that could end badly for all of them if broken openly. She tried everything she could think of to discourage them. She left food that would keep them occupied. She built higher barriers, wedged more securely into the packed earth of the den entrance. She timed her departures for moments when they seemed most deeply asleep, moving as silently as she possibly could. Nothing worked for long. The pups were smart, growing smarter every day, and their attachment to her had deepened into something that resembled the bond between pups and their own mother, fierce and unwavering. One afternoon, returning to the pack house after a visit to the den, Lila felt an odd prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the kind of instinct that told her, without any concrete evidence, that she was being watched. She turned, scanning the tree line behind her, and caught the briefest flash of movement, a small dark shape darting behind a fallen log. Her stomach dropped. She knew, without needing further proof, exactly what she had seen. She hurried back, moving as quickly as she dared without breaking into an outright run that might draw attention from anyone nearby, and found Fen exactly where she feared he would be, crouched low in the underbrush not far from the edge of the clearing that opened onto the pack house grounds. He looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes, tail wagging slightly, utterly unaware of the danger he had put himself in by following her so close to a place full of wolves who would recognize instantly that he did not belong to any known litter within the pack. She gathered him up without a word, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and carried him back to the den at a pace just short of running. The other two pups greeted their siblings' return with excited yips, oblivious to how close they had all come to disaster. Lila sat down heavily on the den floor, pressing a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. This could not continue. She understood that now, with a clarity that frightened her more than anything else had since the night she found them. The pups' loyalty, their determination to stay close to her no matter what barriers she built, was going to expose all of them eventually, and there would be no explanation she could offer that would satisfy pack law once that happened. Taking in orphaned pups without permission was one violation. Allowing them to roam freely near pack territory, unclaimed and unregistered, was another entirely, one that could be read as concealment, as deception, aimed directly at leadership. She needed a better plan, but every option she considered came with its own risks. She could try to move the pups further from pack territory entirely, but that would mean abandoning the safety of at least occasional access to food and shelter, and pups this young would not survive long in truly wild, unclaimed land. She could try to find someone else in the pack she trusted enough to share her secret, someone who might help her manage the growing challenge of keeping 3 lively pups contained. But trust was a luxury Lila had learned, painfully, not to extend easily to anyone. There was one person, she realized slowly, turning the thought over with reluctance. Ellie, a young pack member barely older than the pup's equivalent in human years, timid and often overlooked herself, though for different reasons than Lila's own low rank. Ellie had shown her small kindnesses over the years, quiet gestures that most in the pack would not have noticed or bothered to offer. She had a soft heart, one that had earned her gentle teasing from other pack members, but that Lila had always privately admired. It was a risk, telling anyone. But Lila was beginning to understand that keeping the secret entirely alone was no longer sustainable, not with pups this determined to follow her, not with danger this close to discovery at every turn. She decided, sitting there in the den with 3 warm bodies pressed against her sides, that she would find a way to speak with Ellie, carefully, testing the waters before revealing anything too dangerous. The following evening, she found her chance during a quiet moment in the pack house kitchens, when most of the higher-ranked wolves had already retired for the night, and only a handful of Omegas remained, finishing the last of the cleaning duties assigned to their rank. Ellie was scrubbing a pot at the far end of the room, humming quietly to herself, and Lila approached with a casualness she did not fully feel. "Can I ask you something?" Lila said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that it would not carry beyond the two of them. "Something that needs to stay between us." Ellie looked up, surprised, her hands stilling on the pot. Something in Lila's tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the moment, because she nodded slowly, setting the pot aside and giving Lila her full attention. "Of course," she said. "You can trust me." Lila hesitated, weighing every possible outcome one last time, before deciding that she had already come too far to turn back now. She needed help, and Ellie, of everyone in this pack, seemed the most likely to offer it without judgment. "I found something in the forest," Lila began carefully. "Something I need help keeping safe." She watched Ellie's expression shift from curiosity to concern, as she explained, in careful, quiet words, what she had found that stormy night, and everything that had happened since. She left out no detail, not the danger of discovery, not the growing difficulty of containing 3 increasingly bold pups, not the risk both of them would face if anyone in leadership learned the truth. She wanted Ellie to understand fully what she was agreeing to, before agreeing to anything at all. To her relief, Ellie did not hesitate long before nodding, her eyes wide but resolute. "I'll help you," she said simply. "We can't just leave them to die out there. That's not right, no matter what the law says." Something in Lila's chest loosened at those words. A tension she had carried alone for days, finally finding a small measure of relief. She was not alone anymore, not entirely. Together, she and Ellie began working out a more sustainable plan, dividing the responsibility of gathering food and checking on the pups, coordinating their schedules to minimize the risk of either of them being caught slipping away too often, or too obviously. For a short while, the plan worked well enough that Lila allowed herself to hope, cautiously, that they might actually manage to keep the secret contained until the pups were old enough to be introduced to the pack through some legitimate channel, perhaps framed as an unexpected discovery rather than a long-hidden secret. She began, tentatively, to imagine a future where Fen and his siblings grew up safely within pack territory, where the risk of exposure faded into memory rather than remaining a constant, gnawing fear. But pups did not stay small and easily hidden forever, and the forest that had once felt vast enough to swallow her secret completely was smaller and far more watched than Lila had allowed herself to believe. Scouts patrolled its every corner as part of their regular duties, reporting anything unusual back to pack leadership as a matter of course. And leadership, in the Ashwood pack, meant one figure above all others, a man whose senses were sharper than almost anyone else's in the entire territory, and whose attention, once caught, was not easily redirected. Alpha Gideon Cross had a habit of walking the borders of pack territory himself, rather than relying solely on the reports of his scouts. It was a habit his father had instilled in him from a young age, the belief that a true leader needed to know his land with his own senses, not second-hand through the words of others. It made him difficult to deceive, and it meant that sooner or later, his path was bound to cross the very trail that Lila had worked so hard to keep hidden. The first sign came on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, when Gideon paused mid-stride along a familiar patrol route, his nose catching a scent that did not belong. It was faint, easily missed by a less experienced tracker, layered carefully beneath the ordinary smells of damp earth and forest growth. But Gideon had spent his entire life honing his senses to a precision few in the pack could match, and this particular scent, unfamiliar and out of place, snagged his attention immediately. He crouched low, studying the ground with a focus that had earned him his reputation as one of the most capable trackers the Ashwood pack had ever known. Small paw prints, several sets, crossed and recrossed a narrow stretch of forest floor, weaving in patterns that suggested play rather than purposeful travel. Pup prints, and layered among them, unmistakably, the scent of an omega, one he recognized vaguely, but could not immediately place. Gideon straightened slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the surrounding trees, his mind already working through the implications of what he had found. There were no registered litters currently unaccounted for within pack territory. Every pup born in recent months had a claimed den, a known mother, a place within the structured hierarchy of pack life. Whatever these prints belonged to, they did not fit into that structure, and that fact alone was enough to demand further investigation. He said nothing to his scouts about the discovery, choosing instead to keep the matter private for the moment, driven by an instinct he did not fully examine, but trusted nonetheless. Something about the situation felt delicate, in need of careful handling, rather than the blunt force of an official investigation, that would likely frighten away whatever, or whoever, was responsible before he had a chance to understand what was truly happening. Over the following days, Gideon made a quiet habit of returning to that stretch of forest, studying the trail whenever his duties allowed, piecing together fragments of a story he could not yet fully see. He noted the pattern of the omega scent, growing more familiar with each visit, and eventually, walking the boundary near the pack house grounds during a routine check, he caught the same scent again, fresher this time, mixed unmistakably with the scent he had already come to associate with a particular quiet, unassuming omega, who rarely drew attention to herself during pack gatherings. Lila Hart. The name settled into his memory with an odd weight, an Omega he could recall seeing perhaps a handful of times, always at the edges of rooms, always the first to lower her eyes when his gaze happened to pass over her. He had never had reason to think much of her before, had never had reason to think of her at all, beyond the vague awareness every alpha carried of the members within his pack. But now, faced with evidence that connected her directly to a trail of unregistered pup prints deep in the forest, he found himself thinking of very little else. He did not confront her immediately. Instead, driven by a caution that surprised even himself, he decided to watch, to gather more information before drawing conclusions or taking action that could not be undone. Whatever was happening, whatever secret this quiet Omega was keeping, he intended to understand the full shape of it before he moved. He had no idea, as he made that careful decision, just how much that choice would come to change him. Lila had no idea she was being watched. In her mind, the greatest danger she faced remained the pup's own restlessness, their growing tendency to wander further from the den each day, as their legs grew stronger, and their curiosity outpaced their caution. She spent every spare moment she could steal working with Ellie to reinforce the den's boundaries, to teach the pups, as much as pups that age could be taught anything, to stay close and stay quiet. It was working, imperfectly, but well enough that the days began to settle into something resembling a routine. She would finish her duties in the pack house, slip away under some small pretense, meet Ellie near the forest edge, and together they would make their way to the den, bringing food, checking on the pup's health, spending precious stolen minutes, simply enjoying the small, fierce joy of watching 3 lives grow stronger because of their care. Fen, in particular, had begun to develop a personality distinctly his own, bolder than his siblings, quicker to explore, always the one pressing furthest against the boundaries Lila tried to set. He had taken to greeting her with an enthusiastic bound the moment she appeared at the den entrance, his small body nearly toppling over with the force of his excitement, and despite every worry weighing on her, Lila found she could not help but smile every single time. "You're going to get us caught," she told him one evening, only half joking, as he climbed determinedly into her lap for what felt like the 100th time that week. "You have to learn to be patient." Fen, of course, understood none of this, and simply pressed his small head against her hand, demanding attention with the shameless confidence of a pup who had never known anything but affection from the woman who had saved his life. Watching him, watching all 3 of them grow more comfortable, more trusting, more alive with each passing day, Lila felt a fierce protectiveness settle permanently into her chest, a feeling she suspected would never fully leave her, no matter what happened next. She did not yet know that what happened next would arrive far sooner than she expected, and that the man responsible for uncovering her secret was not some distant threat she could avoid through careful planning, but the very alpha who ruled over every corner of the territory she called home. Ellie, for her part, grew increasingly nervous as the days passed, her natural timidity warring against the fierce loyalty she had developed toward the pups almost as quickly as Lila had. She voiced her concerns carefully, aware of how much this secret meant to her friend, but unable to fully silence the anxious voice in the back of her mind that whispered warnings about how precarious their situation truly was. "What happens if someone finds them?" Ellie asked one evening, watching the pups tumble over each other in a clumsy wrestling match near the den entrance. "What happens to you if the alpha finds out what we've been doing?" Lila did not have a good answer to that question. She had turned it over in her mind more times than she could count, imagining every possible consequence, from a simple reprimand to full exile, and she had never managed to convince herself that the outcome would be anything but severe. Pack law existed for reasons she understood, even if she did not always agree with how rigidly it was enforced against those with the least power to defend themselves. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but I couldn't leave them out there to die. Whatever happens to me because of that choice, I'll accept it. I just need enough time to make sure they're strong enough to survive on their own first, in case it comes to that." Ellie nodded slowly, though the worry in her eyes did not fully fade. She did not push further, understanding, perhaps better than most, the particular kind of stubborn courage that had led Lila to make this choice in the first place, and respecting it too much to try to talk her out of a path she had already committed to walking, no matter where it led. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet moment of shared resolve, the faint rustle of movement in the trees beyond the den, far enough away to avoid detection by pup senses still developing, but close enough for a far more experienced observer to catch every word carried on the evening air. Gideon stood motionless among the shadows, absorbing what he had just witnessed and heard. It was more than he had expected to find. Not simply an Omega who had stumbled upon abandoned pups and made an impulsive decision to help them, but a deliberate, sustained effort, involving at least one other pack member, carried out with a level of care and planning that spoke to something deeper than mere sentiment. He had watched Lila Hart interact with those pups for several minutes now, watched the way they responded to her, the trust radiating from every small movement, and he found himself reassessing everything he thought he understood about the quiet Omega he had barely registered before this week. He was not accustomed to hesitation. As Alpha, his role required decisiveness, clarity, the ability to enforce pack law fairly but firmly, without allowing personal sympathy to cloud judgment that affected the safety and stability of everyone under his protection. And yet, watching this scene unfold before him, he found himself reluctant to simply step forward and end it with the authority his position granted him. There was more to understand here, he told himself, more to the story than a simple violation of law. He thought of the fallen wolves Lila had mentioned, the parents whose deaths had left these pups orphaned in the first place, and a cold, uneasy feeling settled in his gut, an instinct that told him this discovery was tangled up in something far larger than a single Omega's act of compassion. He withdrew quietly, careful not to disturb the scene before him, his mind already turning toward the questions he needed answered before he decided how to proceed. Who were the pups' parents? What had happened to them, out there in the storm, close enough to pack territory that their deaths should have been noticed and reported through official channels? And why, if this had truly been an attack, had no one brought word of it to him directly? The answers, he suspected, would not be simple. And as he made his way back toward the pack house, already turning over the beginnings of a plan to investigate further before revealing what he had learned, he found himself thinking, with an intensity that unsettled him slightly, of the quiet determination he had witnessed in Lila Hart's face as she cradled a small, trusting pup against her chest. Whatever this secret truly was, he intended to uncover every layer of it, carefully, deliberately, and with far more patience than his position typically allowed him to spend on matters this small. Something told him this was not a small matter at all. Gideon spent the following days doing something he rarely had reason to do as Alpha, quietly gathering information without revealing his purpose to anyone, including the advisors who usually sat close beside him during matters of pack security. He reviewed old patrol reports, searching for any mention of unusual activity near the section of forest where he had found the pup prints. He questioned scouts casually, framing his inquiries as routine boundary checks rather than a focused investigation, careful not to raise suspicion about what he was truly pursuing. What he found troubled him more with each passing hour. There had been reports, buried and largely dismissed at the time, of unfamiliar wolves crossing near the northern boundary of Ashwood territory in the weeks before the storm that had orphaned the pups. The reports had been vague, unconfirmed sightings rather than direct encounters, and had not been deemed significant enough to escalate to his attention through the normal chain of command. Reading them now, with new context in mind, Gideon felt a familiar unease sharpen into something closer to certainty. He thought immediately of Marcus Vale, a name that still carried weight in certain circles of the pack, though not the kind of weight anyone wished to claim. Marcus had once held a position of some influence within Ashwood territory, a distant cousin of Gideon's own bloodline, until ambition had curdled into something darker, and he had been cast out years earlier for actions the pack still spoke of, only in hushed, careful tones. Since his exile, rumors of Marcus building alliances among rogue wolves and disaffected packs had drifted back to Ashwood territory periodically, though nothing concrete had ever surfaced to justify direct action against him. If Marcus had returned, even briefly, close enough to Ashwood borders to be responsible for the deaths Lila had described, the implications stretched far beyond 3 orphaned pups. It meant a threat to the pack's security that demanded far more than quiet, personal investigation. And yet, Gideon found himself hesitant to move forward with anything official until he understood the full picture, including the identity of the pups' parents, information that might explain exactly why they had been targeted at all. He decided, finally, that the only way to gather the answers he needed was to speak with Lila directly, not as an accusation, not as a formal confrontation carrying the full weight of his authority, but as a quiet conversation between two people who both, it seemed, had reason to want the truth uncovered. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until an afternoon when he knew, from days of careful observation, that Lila would be making her way toward the forest edge alone, Ellie occupied elsewhere with other duties that day. He positioned himself along the path she typically took, not hidden this time, but standing openly, allowing her to see him from a distance, so she would have no reason to feel ambushed or cornered. Lila froze the moment she spotted him, her entire body going rigid with a fear so visible it was almost painful to witness. Gideon raised both hands slightly, palms open, a gesture meant to convey that he intended no immediate harm, though he understood the futility of such a gesture, given the power imbalance between an alpha and an omega, who had every reason to expect the worst from this encounter. "I'm not here to punish you," he said, keeping his voice level and calm. "I need to talk to you about what you found in the forest." The color drained from Lila's face, and for a moment, Gideon thought she might turn and run, pups or no pups, driven purely by instinct. But she held her ground, though her hands trembled visibly at her sides, and when she spoke, her voice came out steadier than he expected, threaded through with a quiet defiance that surprised him. "Whatever you're going to do to me," she said, "please, just leave them out of it. They didn't do anything wrong, they're just pups." Something in her tone, the immediate instinct to protect the pups even before considering her own safety, struck Gideon with unexpected force. He had encountered plenty of pack members over the years who prioritized self-preservation above almost everything else, a survival instinct he understood well, given the hierarchy that governed pack life. To see someone so ready to accept consequences for herself, so long as the innocent lives she had chosen to protect remained safe, was rarer than he liked to admit. "I'm not planning to harm them," he said again, more firmly this time. "I give you my word on that. But I need to understand everything. Who they are, what happened to their parents, and why no one reported an attack that close to our borders." Lila studied his face for a long moment, searching for some sign of deception, some hint that his calm demeanor concealed a trap. Finding none, or perhaps simply deciding she had no better option than to trust him, she let out a slow breath and began, haltingly at first, to tell him everything. She described the storm, the crying she had heard in the darkness, the two fallen adult wolves she had found near the pups, already beyond saving. She described her decision to take the pups in, knowing full well the risk she was taking, unable to convince herself that leaving them to die was a choice she could live with. She described the weeks that followed, the careful balancing act of hiding them, feeding them, watching them grow stronger, despite everything working against her. Gideon listened without interrupting, his sharp mind cataloging every detail, searching for anything that might connect to the fragments of information he had already gathered. When she mentioned the location where she had found the pups, close to the northern boundary, his suspicions about Marcus Vale's involvement solidified further, though he kept that thought to himself for the moment, unwilling to burden her with speculation he could not yet confirm. "Can I see them?" he asked finally, once she had finished. "The pups. I need to see them myself." Lila hesitated, old fear warring visibly with the fragile trust that had begun to form during their conversation. But something in Gideon's tone, the genuine concern rather than cold authority, seemed to tip the balance, and after a long moment, she nodded slowly. "Follow me," she said. "But please, be careful with them. They've already lost so much." Gideon nodded, and together, in a silence that felt heavier with unspoken questions than actual tension, they made their way toward the hidden den where 3 lives waited, unaware of the enormous shift about to unfold in the story of their survival. When they arrived, the pups reacted immediately to Lila's presence, tumbling toward her with excited yips, and then freezing, all 3 at once, as they caught sight of the unfamiliar figure standing beside her. Gideon knelt slowly, deliberately, lowering himself to a height less imposing, and waited patiently, allowing the pups to approach on their own terms, rather than closing the distance himself. It was the black pup, the boldest of the 3, who moved first, creeping cautiously closer, sniffing the air, studying Gideon with wide, curious eyes. Something about the way the pup held himself, the particular tilt of his head, the shade of his eyes beneath the dark fur, sent a jolt of recognition through Gideon so sharp, it nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. He had seen that exact coloring before. He had seen those exact eyes before, though not in a pup, not in years, but in the face of someone he had once known well, someone whose absence still occasionally ached in quiet, unexpected moments even after all this time. "What is it?" Lila asked, noticing the sudden shift in his expression, the way his entire body had gone taut with something that looked almost like shock. Gideon did not answer immediately, his eyes still fixed on the small pup now sitting directly in front of him, tail wagging tentatively, as though sensing, in some instinctive way, that this stranger mattered somehow, though he could not have understood why. "I need to run some tests," Gideon said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "But I think I might know who this pup's mother was." The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them fully understood yet, and for the first time since finding those pups in the storm, Lila felt the ground beneath her feet shift in a direction she had never anticipated. Gideon did not explain further that day, though Lila could see the effort it cost him to keep his thoughts contained. He asked only that she continue caring for the pups exactly as she had been, promising to return within a few days once he had confirmed what he suspected, and asking her, with unexpected gentleness, to trust him a little longer. She agreed, though uncertainty gnawed at her the entire time he was gone. She spent those days in a strange, suspended state, going through the motions of her usual duties, while her mind circled endlessly around what Gideon might have meant, what history could possibly connect an alpha king to 3 orphaned pups hidden in a forgotten den on the edge of his own territory. Ellie, when Lila finally told her what had happened, reacted with a mixture of alarm and cautious hope that mirrored Lila's own conflicted feelings. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" Ellie asked, watching Fen chase his tail in dizzy circles near the den entrance. "About not punishing you, I mean." Lila considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know for certain, but he didn't have to come find me the way he did. He could have simply ordered the pups taken and dealt with the situation through official channels. He chose to talk to me first. That has to mean something." She held on to that reasoning during the days that followed, using it to steady her nerves each time doubt threatened to overwhelm her. When Gideon finally returned, his expression grave but not unkind, she found herself holding her breath as she waited for him to speak. "Her name was Wren," he said without preamble, settling onto the ground near the den entrance, as the pups, growing more comfortable with his presence each visit, gathered curiously around him. "She was my sister." The word landed heavily in the quiet space between them. Lila had not expected that particular truth, though in hindsight, the resemblance she had noticed in the black pup's eyes, a resemblance Gideon himself had reacted to so strongly, suddenly made a different kind of sense. "I didn't know you had a sister," Lila said carefully, unsure how much more he intended to share, unwilling to press if the memory clearly caused him pain. Gideon's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, lost in memories that clearly weighed on him, even after however many years had passed. When he finally continued, his voice had gone quieter, rougher around the edges. "She left Ashwood territory a long time ago. There was a disagreement about leadership, about the direction our father wanted to take the pack. She believed in things he refused to consider, and rather than stay and fight a battle she felt certain she would lose, she chose to leave instead. I hadn't heard from her in years. I assumed, honestly, that she had built a life somewhere far from here, somewhere safe." He paused, glancing toward the black pup, who had settled contentedly against his knee, seemingly unbothered by the weight of the conversation happening above his small head. "I think this is her son," Gideon said finally. "I think Wren came back, whether by choice or by circumstance, close enough to our borders, that whoever attacked her found her before she ever had the chance to reach out to me directly." The implications of that statement settled slowly over both of them. If Wren had returned, even briefly, with intentions unknown, and if her death had truly been an attack rather than an accident, then someone had deliberately targeted her. Someone who either recognized her connection to Ashwood leadership, or had reasons of their own for wanting her silenced. "Do you think it was Marcus?" Lila asked quietly, remembering the name Gideon had mentioned briefly during their first conversation, the exiled relative whose reputation still cast long shadows over certain corners of pack history. Gideon's expression darkened further. "I think it's likely. Marcus has never forgiven our family for the way his exile was handled. If he discovered Ren had returned, especially if she was seeking to reconnect with the pack, or worse, seeking to challenge the current leadership structure with a legitimate claim of her own, he would have every incentive to eliminate that threat before it could gain any traction. Lila absorbed this new information slowly, turning it over in her mind, trying to understand what it meant for the pups now settled so trustingly around them both. If Ren had truly been targeted because of her bloodline, because of the potential threat her return represented to certain factions within and beyond the pack, then her pups, carrying that same bloodline, might still be in danger, even now, even hidden away in this quiet den. "They're not safe here, are they?" she said slowly, dread creeping into her voice as the full weight of the situation became clear. If Marcus finds out they survived. Gideon met her eyes, and the grim resolve she saw there told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke the words aloud. "No," he said, "they're not. Which means we need a better plan than a hidden den in the forest. And it means I need to bring this to the pack, carefully, in a way that protects them, rather than exposes them further." The prospect of bringing the secret into the open terrified Lila on multiple levels at once. Part of her feared the consequences she had long anticipated for herself, the punishment that pack law technically demanded for her actions. But a larger, more urgent fear now centered entirely on the pups themselves, on the very real possibility that revealing their existence, even to protect them, might instead paint a target on their backs that could not easily be removed. "How do we protect them?" she asked, "without putting them at even greater risk?" Gideon considered the question with the same careful deliberation he applied to every major decision affecting the pack's safety. "We move slowly," he said finally. "I'll need to speak with a small circle of trusted advisors first. People I know will keep this contained, rather than spreading word before we're ready. We'll need increased security around the den immediately, and eventually, once we're confident the immediate threat has been assessed and addressed, we bring them into the pack house properly, under full protection, with their true heritage acknowledged rather than hidden." It was not a perfect plan, and both of them understood that clearly. There were too many unknowns, too many ways things could still go wrong, especially if Marcus Vale truly remained a threat lurking somewhere beyond the borders they could see and control. But it was, at least, a plan built on more than desperate improvisation, and for the first time since finding the pups in that storm, Lila felt the beginnings of genuine hope that this story might end somewhere safer than she had allowed herself to imagine. Over the following days, Gideon moved carefully, exactly as he had promised. He brought two of his most trusted advisors into confidence, sharing only what was necessary to secure their cooperation, and arranged for a discreet increase in patrols around the section of forest containing the hidden den, framed to the wider pack as a routine response to the earlier unconfirmed sightings near the northern boundary, rather than anything connected to Lila or the pups directly. Lila continued her visits to the den, though now accompanied more frequently by Gideon himself, whose presence, she noticed with some surprise, the pups had come to accept with the same easy trust they had extended to her from the very beginning. Fen, in particular, seemed to have decided that Gideon belonged to their small makeshift family now, greeting him with the same enthusiastic bounds he reserved for Lila, climbing determinedly into his lap despite Gideon's initial, poorly concealed discomfort at being treated with such casual affection by a creature so much smaller and more vulnerable than himself. "He likes you," Lila observed one evening, watching Gideon awkwardly accept Fen's insistent nuzzling, with an expression caught somewhere between amusement and bewilderment. "He has terrible judgment, apparently," Gideon replied dryly, though the corner of his mouth twitched with something close to a smile, an expression Lila realized she had rarely, if ever, seen on his face during the brief, distant encounters they'd had before all of this began. Those quiet evenings, watching the pups grow more secure, more playful, more confidently themselves with each passing day, became something Lila found herself looking forward to with an intensity that surprised her. The fear that had defined her days for weeks had not disappeared entirely, not with Marcus Vale still an unresolved threat somewhere beyond their control, but it had softened into something more manageable, tempered by the presence of allies she had not expected to find, in Ellie's steady loyalty, and, more surprisingly, in Gideon's quiet, careful commitment to protecting 3 lives that shared, however distantly, a connection to his own family. She began to see him differently during those evenings, the careful, controlled alpha giving way, in these private moments, to someone who laughed more easily than she would have guessed, who spoke of his sister with a grief that ran deeper than his controlled exterior usually allowed him to show, who treated the pups not as political complications to be managed, but as innocent lives worth protecting, simply because they deserved protection, regardless of the danger that decision carried. "Thank you," she told him one evening, as they sat together near the den entrance, watching the pups settle into sleep after a long afternoon of play, "for not turning us in the moment you found out, for choosing to understand first, before deciding what to do." Gideon glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You risked everything, for 3 pups who weren't yours, who had no claim on you at all, beyond the fact that they needed help. That's not something I could have punished, even if pack law demanded it. Whatever consequences you might have faced, I don't think you deserved them. I think you deserve recognition, not punishment." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Lila looked away first, her cheeks warming, despite the cool evening air, and busied herself with adjusting the leaves beneath the sleeping pups, though her mind remained fixed on the unexpected warmth of his words. Whatever this was becoming, between the careful alliance formed to protect 3 innocent lives, and something else entirely, something neither of them had anticipated when this story began, Lila found herself unwilling to examine it too closely, afraid that doing so might somehow disturb the fragile, precious thing, growing steadily between them despite everything working against it. Marcus Vale, however, remained an unresolved shadow hanging over all of them, and neither Lila nor Gideon could afford to forget, even during their quietest moments together, that the true test of everything they had built was still to come. The warning came sooner than anyone anticipated. Late one evening, a scout returned from the northern boundary, with news that sent a ripple of tension through the small circle of advisors Gideon had brought into his confidence. Unfamiliar scents, several of them, had been detected crossing into Ashwood territory, under cover of darkness, moving with a deliberate, coordinated pattern that suggested something far more organized than a random trespass. Gideon received the report with the calm, controlled demeanor his position demanded, though inwardly, dread coiled tight in his chest. He did not need confirmation to know, with near certainty, exactly who was responsible. Marcus Vale had learned, somehow, that his sister's pups had survived, and he was moving now to finish what he had started in that storm weeks earlier. "Increase patrols along the entire northern boundary," Gideon ordered, his voice steady despite the urgency pulsing beneath his words. "Quietly. I don't want this treated as a general alarm yet. Not until we understand the scale of what we're facing." He left the meeting immediately after, moving with a speed that betrayed the calm he had maintained in front of his advisors, heading straight for the hidden den where Lila would be waiting, unaware of the danger now closing in far faster than any of them had prepared for. He found her exactly where he expected, sitting with the pups in the fading evening light, and the moment she saw his expression, she rose immediately, alarm sharpening her features. "What's happened?" she asked, already moving to gather the pups closer, some instinct warning her that whatever news he carried demanded immediate action. "Marcus," Gideon said simply. "He knows. He's moving toward the territory now, with others. We need to get you and the pups somewhere more secure, immediately." Lila did not waste time asking further questions, gathering the pups quickly into her arms, as Gideon helped, the 2 of them working with the swift, practiced efficiency they had developed over weeks of careful cooperation. The den, once a sanctuary, now felt dangerously exposed, its location too well established, too easily traced by anyone determined enough to search for it. "There's a safe room in the pack house," Gideon said, leading the way through the darkening forest at a pace that pushed Lila's endurance to its limit. The pups clutched tightly against her chest. "Reinforced, defensible. We'll be able to protect them properly there, with the full strength of the pack behind us, rather than relying on secrecy alone." The journey back felt far longer than it truly was, every shadow along the path seeming to hold potential threat, every distant sound, making Lila's heart lurch with fear that Marcus and his allies had already found them. Gideon stayed close beside her the entire way, alert and tense, his senses stretched wide to catch any hint of danger before it could reach them. They made it to the pack house without incident, and Gideon moved quickly to secure the pups within the fortified safe room he had mentioned. arranging for trusted guards to stand watch immediately, their loyalty and discretion already proven through the quiet cooperation they had offered in the days leading up to this moment. Lila stayed with the pups, refusing to leave their side even as exhaustion and fear threatened to overwhelm her entirely, while Gideon moved through the pack house with a focused urgency that left no doubt about the seriousness of the threat now bearing down on them. Word spread quickly once Gideon made the decision to bring the wider pack leadership into full awareness of the situation. There was no more room for secrecy now, not with Marcus Vale's forces closing in on the territory, and Gideon addressed his senior wolves directly, laying out the truth plainly: the pups' true heritage, the danger they represented to Marcus's ambitions, and the immediate threat now facing all of Ashwood territory as a result. To his relief, though not entirely to his surprise, the pack rallied quickly once the full picture became clear. Whatever reservations some might have held about an Omega taking matters into her own hands weeks earlier faded quickly in the face of a far more pressing concern: the safety of the pack as a whole, against an enemy who had already proven willing to kill without hesitation. The confrontation, when it came, arrived with the harsh suddenness of a storm breaking after days of gathering pressure. Marcus Vale's forces struck at the northern boundary under cover of darkness, testing the pack's defenses with a probing assault that Gideon's reinforced patrols met with fierce, coordinated resistance. The fighting was intense but brief, Ashwood's superior numbers and preparation proving more than sufficient to repel the initial assault, though not without cost, several wolves on both sides sustaining injuries before the attackers retreated back across the boundary, driven off, but not entirely defeated. Gideon led the defense personally, his presence on the front lines rallying his wolves with a confidence and skill that reminded everyone present exactly why he had earned the position of Alpha King in the first place. When the fighting finally subsided, and word reached the safe room that the immediate threat had been contained, Lila felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. The pups pressed close against her, sensing, in their own instinctive way, that the danger surrounding them had finally begun to recede. Marcus himself was not captured that night, slipping away with a portion of his remaining forces before Ashwood wolves could corner him fully, but the message had been sent clearly enough. His attempt to eliminate the last remnants of Wren's bloodline had failed, and Ashwood territory, now fully aware of the threat he represented, would not be caught unprepared again. In the days that followed, as the pack settled from the immediate crisis into a period of careful, watchful recovery, Gideon made good on the promise he had given Lila weeks earlier. He brought the pups forward publicly, acknowledging their heritage as descendants of his own family line, and formally welcomed them into Ashwood territory, under the full protection of pack law, their status secured beyond any question or challenge. He did not stop there. Standing before the assembled pack, in a gesture that surprised many and moved others deeply, Gideon spoke openly about Lila's role in the pups' survival, praising the courage and compassion she had shown in choosing to protect 3 innocent lives, despite the personal risk involved, despite the low status that might have made silence and self-preservation the easier, safer choice for anyone else in her position. An Omega who risks everything for lives that aren't her own, who asks for nothing in return, has shown more strength of character than many wolves who hold far higher rank, Gideon told the gathered pack, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. That kind of courage deserves recognition, not the quiet dismissal our traditions too often extend to those in her position, he announced. Then, a formal elevation of Lila's status within the pack, a recognition that would grant her greater standing, greater voice, and greater protection than her previous rank had ever afforded her. The pack, moved by the story that had unfolded before them, and by the undeniable proof of Marcus Vale's continued threat that made Lila's early instincts seem prescient rather than merely impulsive, received the announcement with something approaching genuine warmth, a response Lila had never dared to expect from wolves who had, for years, treated her presence as barely worth noticing. Ellie stood among the crowd that day, tears of relief and pride shining openly on her face as she watched her friend receive recognition so long overdue. The pups, now formally introduced to the pack as Fen, Ivy, and Birch, names Lila had chosen carefully during the quiet weeks of their hidden care, bounded excitedly among the gathered wolves, utterly unaware of the significance of the moment, simply delighted by the attention and warmth now surrounding them from every direction. In the weeks that followed, Life within Ashwood territory settled into a new rhythm, one that included, much to the continued surprise of pack members who remembered Lila's former quiet obscurity, regular visits from the Alpha King himself to the quarters now assigned to her and the pups, quarters far removed from the cramped, overlooked spaces she had once called home as the lowest-ranked member of the pack. Gideon found himself drawn to those visits for reasons that extended well beyond his responsibility to Wren's surviving children, though he took that responsibility seriously, spending time with the pups regularly, teaching them small lessons about pack life, watching over their growth with the careful attention of someone determined not to fail his sister's memory a second time. But it was Lila's company he found himself craving most, the easy warmth that had grown between them during those tense, secretive weeks in the forest, deepening now into something neither of them felt any particular urgency to rush, content instead to let it unfold naturally, built on a foundation far sturdier than most bonds formed within the more traditional, hierarchical structures of pack courtship. "You know," Lila told him one evening, watching Fen attempt, with limited success, to teach his siblings a clumsy game he had apparently invented himself. "When I found them that night, I never imagined any of this. I thought I was making a choice that would end with me exiled, or worse. I never thought it would end here." Gideon watched her profile in the soft evening light, struck, not for the first time, by how completely his understanding of her had transformed since that first tense confrontation weeks earlier. "Sometimes the choices that terrify us the most turn out to matter more than we could have known at the time," he said quietly. "You didn't just save 3 lives that night. You reminded this entire pack what real courage looks like." Lila turned to meet his eyes, something warm and steady passing between them, unspoken, but clearly understood by both. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, with Marcus Vale still at large somewhere beyond their borders, with the ongoing work of rebuilding trust and security across pack territory, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was not facing any of it alone. The pups grew stronger and bolder with each passing season, thriving under the combined protection of a pack that had come to embrace them fully, and under the particular, devoted care of the Omega, who had refused to let them die alone in a storm, and the Alpha King, who had chosen understanding over judgment when he discovered the truth of what she had done. Their story, once a closely guarded secret, hidden in a forgotten den on the edge of the forest, became instead a story told openly throughout Ashwood territory, a reminder to every pack member, regardless of rank, that compassion and courage mattered more than the labels the world tried to assign them. And in the quiet evenings that followed, as 3 orphaned pups grew up surrounded by love they had once nearly been denied entirely, Lila Hart, once the pack's most overlooked Omega, found herself standing at the center of a new kind of family, one built not on rigid hierarchy or ancient tradition, but on the fierce, unshakable bond formed the night she chose to follow a cry for help into the darkness, and never once looked back.